Welcome to our session today. This is the first webinar in a series, Bridging the Gap Between Patients and Pharma. My name is Sarah Sigelko. I'm going to be the moderator for today's discussion, and I want you to know that I'm a breast cancer survivor with a nursing background, and I've got a history in the pharma field for over 16 years. Currently, I'm at Trajectory as the Director of Clinical Operations, and we at Trajectory are very happy to be hosting this webinar session today. So today we're going to discuss diversity in clinical trials, specifically from the patient's point of view. And we're going to examine the barriers as to why minority patients have historically shied away from participating in clinical trials. We're going to explore the topics of trust and education, as well as shed some light into maybe next steps of what to do about that. We want you to walk away from this session with a better understanding of challenges that have prevented diversity in clinical trials and some ideas about what can be done to help you effectively achieve your diverse representation in your clinical trials. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists for today's discussion. And first and foremost is our Trajectory patient champion, Christy Fields. Christy, we're so happy to have her here today. Christy has fought both breast and colon cancer while raising 4 children. She is a military veteran, and she has earned a master's degree in health sciences. Christy took her experience with cancer and turned it into activism by creating an organization called Pink Slayer, which is focused on minorities going through breast cancer. We welcome Christy as the voice of the patient during today's discussion. And from the world of pharmaceutical and drug development, we're welcomed and pleased to have these 3 representatives. The first is Alicia Stilton-Lloyd, the Vice President of Medical Affairs of Imago Biosciences. Next, we have Gisu Dikotis, Head of Global Advocacy at Daiichi Sankyo, and JJ Ferrer, who is here today from Head of Precision Medicine Strategy and Commercialization at Merus. Thank you for being here today, and we welcome this important discussion. So some of you may be wondering why we're here today, why this topic is coming up, and why now. In April of this year, the FDA released a guidance document which pushes increased racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials. They established Project Equity, which is a public health initiative to ensure that data submitted to the FDA for approval for oncology medical products adequately reflects the demographic representation of patients for whom the medical products are intended. So we're going to dive right in now. Our first topic is going to be trust. And I'm going to pose this question to Christy as the patient advocate on this team. There seems to be a general lack of trust between minority populations and the pharmaceutical industry. Can you explain to us why that is, and maybe why, what are some of the myths that are passed down from generation to generation?
Sure. Let me first start off by thanking you for the wonderful introduction. It's an honor to be here with everyone on the panel. The lack of trust dates all the way back to slavery, when slaves were sold into sold to medical professionals for experiments against their will, of course. These were very painful experiments they were undergoing, but they in turn passed down stories from generation to generation. The unfortunate part of that, once you pass down the story, it gets changed. So I'm pretty sure by the time it got to like the 3rd or 4th generation down, it was a totally different story, probably told extremely worse than what already had happened. And it just increased the lack of trust. One of the more notable experiments was the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which we all know pretty much what happened during that time, where there was 600 Black men who were, some was infected with syphilis during this clinical research because they wanted to try to find something to cure it. Needless to say, this was before all the current protocols was put into place, which is called an IRB, which give you all the information you need about a clinical trial. You will sign it, and it gives you all the ethical information that can happen and cannot happen in this document. Another notable, I don't want to call this an experiment because it really wasn't intended to be, but this one was the HeLa cells, which a young woman by the name of Henrietta Lacks went into Johns Hopkins several times. It was misdiagnosed. She actually had to find her own tumor. She had cervical cancer. When she went back to Johns Hopkins, she had to tell her doctor exactly where to look to get to see her tumor, because all the other times before they didn't see it. They was diagnosing her with things like gonorrhea and different sexual transmitted diseases. And not to say they were not there, but they missed the tumor multiple times. By the time she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, it was already past the time to reverse it. While undergoing the surgery to remove the tumor, the doctor also removed some of her cells. Now, the good thing about her cells was they was able to live outside the Petri dish, which other cells wasn't. Her cells is responsible for every vaccine known to date. Her family had no idea that her cells was used to make medicine. And they too was brought in to get cells. They draw blood on her family to see if they can get the same result that they got with her. So they too was pulled into a clinical trial without their knowledge. And of course, when you tell the story, things change. I'm pretty sure the story changed from what actually happened to add more content, I guess, to make it more interesting. So with all these stories going down with the misconduct that's happened in previous years, it caused a lack of trust in the minority community.
So Christy, thank you for sharing that with us. I'd like to ask you one more question about when you had your diagnosis, your first one, because you've been diagnosed a couple of times now. How did your own family and your own experience, how was that affected by, potentially some of these stories that were handed down, and how did that impact your journey?
Well, with my first diagnosis, I thought I was too young to have cancer. I was 37. I felt a tiny, what I thought was an insect bite. When it started growing, I was like, okay, maybe it's not an insect bite, but I still didn't think it was cancer. I was uninsured at the time, and this is before we had anything in place for adults to have free insurance. So we went to different emergency rooms and they saw it there, but no one sent me to get a mammogram or anything. Once they found out I did not have insurance, it was, okay, we're gonna sign her out, there's nothing we can do. So there was no testing done. It did create bad relationship between me and the medical community, because we see it here. The doctors, we all saw it, they felt it. And it wasn't until I went to the VA as a last resort that I was able to finally get a mammogram to see what it was. And, something as simple as a mammogram could save lives. And had I not gone to the VA, my life would not have been saved from the first diagnosis, because no one was willing to provide the correct information for me to get a mammogram and to start my healing process.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I'd like to turn the next question over to our pharma colleagues and panelists, and just ask if you were aware that trust was a major factor contributing to the lack of diversity in clinical trials. If any of you have any comments you'd like to share about that, if that awareness was out there in the pharma community.
Well, I'm sure my colleagues have a lot to offer as well on this subject. I think there was an understanding that there was a lack of trust, but it felt like it was too big of a challenge for a single person or a single team or a single company to tackle. I mean, Christy, your story, your personal story, just shares the frustration and dangers of the healthcare system in general, how you have to be your own advocate, and how, you were misdiagnosed or turned away time and time again until you found, that single individual, that single healthcare system that would actually take the time to work with you and figure out what was going on and what you needed for your health. So I think as a pharmaceutical company, we're within this larger healthcare system that has all of these barriers to trust. And a lot of that is communication. A lot of that is healthcare providers being able to have the time to really listen to their patients, and the patients needing to self-advocate, to go in and sort of demand the time and demand appropriate diagnosis. So I think the problem felt really, really large. And one of the things I'm excited to hear today is, that all of the ways, the small ways that patients and healthcare systems and, sponsors and the regulatory agencies have helped us shift that conversation to begin to look at, if trust is the issue, how do we partner together to begin to address some of those misconceptions that are at the very, fundamentals of that mistrust? And how do we communicate effectively? And communicating effectively isn't about us going forward and saying, okay, here are the facts, here's the reality, here's the data. It's about a dialogue. It's listening to what people need, listening to individual patients, listening to patient advocacy groups like Pink Slayer. And I'm really excited to be where we are now, where there are people who are willing to sit down and dialogue, willing to acknowledge what they themselves as part of this overall clinical trials process, the barriers that we're facing and the risks of, sort of tackling those barriers. So I turn it over to, I think, Gisu. I'm sure she's got a lot of great ideas and understanding on what the trust issue is.
Thank you so much, Alicia. There has been a trust issue, but there's also been a system that does not treat everyone with the same level of trust. So folks who don't see people that look like them within the health system have a hard time opening up and trusting. So it's really important for us as pharma to help organizations that are professional organizations realize where the gaps are and how to close those gaps by having physicians go into areas and systems that will actually help patients at all levels, all cultural backgrounds, and be sensitive to the needs of those patients. So it's really important, Christy, what you told us. We have seen it in other places. It's not just African Americans, but other Hispanic and other cultures as well. It needs to be fixed, and I'm very hopeful that it could be fixed now.
I don't have much to add. I think you guys summed that up very well, but I would probably just think about, there's gaps. We have to understand how to listen or get the insights, right? And then really what to do with it, because sometimes we listen, but we don't do anything about it. And for me, that's part of the challenge on making sure that we can do something about it, making sure that we can keep pushing the agenda, the envelope, right, to get things done. And part of some of the probably experiences I've had is a lot about, yes, the communication, but it's really the willingness and the education and the openness. And that's part of the trust at the end of the day, right? Do I trust you that the information that you're bringing to me is valuable? Yes or no, right? And I think it's just it's a process that has been, to your point, Giso, growing. It's going to the right elements, but we're not there yet. There's still so many misinformation, misunderstanding, lack of follow-up that happens that, at the end of the day, the fault goes and the challenge is the patient, right? Because that's the patient is the one that's going to be suffering. So I think there's a lot of work to do behind this at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you all for your comments. And I think there's kind of a common thread there. And our next topic is education. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to just touch back with Christy and say on the trust topic, we're going to segue into education, but what other elements do you think from patient community point of view, from an advocate point of view, what other elements could we maybe bring in other than education to help with that trust issue? Do you have any other comments you'd like to add?
One way I would say to help with the trust issue is to be more visible. You don't have to look like me for me to listen if you are engaging. One of my things that I want to try to get up to do, if I get the backing, is to have a health festival. I want medical professionals in the neighborhoods where you can speak to Mr. Johnny and say, how are you doing today? You want a Coke or, a sandwich or something? And just have a conversation with him. And while having this conversation, this is just an example. You may see Mr. Johnny is 75 years old, African-American male that smokes. So he may say, well, doc, I've been trying to quit these things since I was 20 and I just can't do it. That's your doorway to say, well, I might can come up with something to assist you with that. And because you're having this conversation with him one-on-one, he's more likely to join this trial that you're offering because he's beginning to trust you because one, you're in his neighborhood and you're talking and you're listening to him. So you don't necessarily have to, you don't necessarily have to look like the person that you're going to help. But if they feel a connection with you, they're more likely to trust you and say, well, you know what? Let's talk about this more because I really do want to stop smoking. And if you have something that I can just slap on my shoulder, then hey, I'll try it if it don't hurt, So that's a doorway. And I know it's unrealistic to think that you can go in every neighborhood in America, but it's a start.
So I'm hearing you with that local presence and increasing that piece of education that could be out there in the community. So let's pivot to the education topic now. So I think we've established that historically diverse populations haven't necessarily been educated on clinical trials in the clinical trial space. Other than these health fairs and things like that, where we could do some education pieces for our pharma colleagues, what other things do we think that industry could do other than the options that Christy has brought forth in order to increase the level of education in patients when it comes to clinical trials, specifically relating to diverse populations?
We could always provide information in a layman's terms so patients could understand what the issues are. We could help communities have health fairs. There has traditionally not been the open access to a lot of these trials. They've been in, institutions where the patients may not have been, but to bring it into the communities and have those discussions happen naturally, as you said, Christy, it sounds like the cop on the beat, basically the dog on the beat, but it could be easy to do in small communities, and then those communities add up to be the country.
I am one of the, I love the idea about how do we communicate more effectively with different communities? How do we educate them on clinical trials? And one way that we're exploring and supporting is through working with patient advocacy groups and larger organizations like the National Health Council and Patient-Focused Medicines Developments Group of how do we get that information on clinical trials in general out there, that in a meaningful way, communicating effectively with various communities that haven't had that touch point before. But on a very specific level, one of the commitments that we have at my company at Imago is that every time we release data from any of our clinical trials, we create a plain language resource version of that data. So when we present at a major conference or present a poster, we are now committing to making sure that we're creating an understandable, summation, targeted at patients and built in conversation with patients and then iterated over and over again as we get feedback about what that data means. And that's part of our commitment, not only to those who are in the clinical trials with us, but to those patients who are eagerly awaiting the results and those that care about them. So I think the desire to communicate data in a plain language manner is going to be something that is very key to us as an industry, effectively reaching out to the patients that we're here for.
Couldn't agree more. I think that grade 4 kind of like communication is critical, but the activation and the, from a pharma side, I think that's, the focus on making sure we communicate to the patient advocacy groups are critical, right? Doing the types of fairs, I think there's just a misconception around how clinical trials work for people that don't know about them. And I think this is a lot of work. It's not just going to be one pharma pushing this. This is a hold hands together and make sure that people understand it, because there's just a misconception. And I think that part of making sure that we're connected to the patient, connected to the advocacy groups is critical. But again, in those areas where it's more marginalized, it gets very complex. It's a reality, right? It's not that easy to get there by all means. And I think making sure, I really applaud the work that you guys are doing, Alicia, on getting that information in that type of, communication format it's really great. I mean, this is the things that you need to do to make sure that you can take it down, right? So yeah, there's no secret recipe. I think it's just the effort that we have to make sure that we are consciously thinking about the audience and bringing that content to them and educational capabilities, and holding hands and making sure that people see value. And the trust factor is really important because there's a lot of mistrust around even advocacy groups or even, other engagements. And I think that's a part of that. We need to work as an industry to make sure that we can provide that trust factor so people can start getting involved into this, specifically for clinical trials.
Not all patients go to advocacy groups,
No.
I'm worried more about those who are not information seeking. How do we get to them? The ones that go to patient advocacy, I can reach through the patient organizations. But the ones that are in the communities that don't look for information, we need everyone to be able to actually bring the information to them.
I think you bring a really good point. This is where, in my prior job, I did a lot of work behind that, right? From a digital perspective, because that now becomes a huge outlet, right? And how we as an industry should be really evaluating how to target these groups, right? Again, compliantly. But, there is that focus that we need to embrace it. We need to lead it because nobody else will, right? And then the question is, we have to get people comfortable within our companies to do something like this too. It's not that easy either. There's so much compliance behind it, right? On when you start having a conversation with a patient. So that's the part that I think digital can really start helping us drive that. And I know there's a topic behind that in this session, but I think that's a really critical part on how to start learning and pushing that capability to really reach broader audiences.
Dr. Google works.
Well, but to Christy's point, I mean, I think, Christy, your vision was of the doctor in the neighborhood having a conversation, a casual conversation that can help shift someone's health perspective and health outlet. How do we go to where we need to be? Which I think, JJ, is your point, right? We can be everywhere, but how do we be where we need to be for those patients that Gisu mentioned aren't already self-activated? Any thoughts on that, Christy? I know you're an amazing person. And so you've connected you were your own advocate. You're helping other people be their own advocates. But how do we find those individuals that really need the support, but are sort of circles beyond circles from where we're currently speaking and where we're currently reaching?
Right. Well, one of the things that I've done, I signed up to work the local farmers market. Now, in the beginning, I was like, I don't sell anything. Why am I doing this? But I have gotten to so many ears through the farmers market to the point where people actually come out there to seek me out to ask questions. So I have to constantly remind people I'm not a medical doctor, but I just have knowledge. I'm not clinical, but I have the knowledge. And I refer them to local doctors and things of that nature. I've also went and knocked on doors. Granted, I would take my husband with me because some of the neighborhoods was, not as safe at a certain time of day. But, you have to knock on doors. You have to, I know there's a lot of commercials. I remember seeing TV ads for different types of pharmaceutical medicines that I had no clue about. And once I see the commercial, I go to Googling. So we have TV ads, radio ads, Facebook, digital, like JJ was saying, however we can get even if it's signing up for a local farmers market. It was so popular here in Suffolk that I had got a call from the city of Newport News to come there and do their farmers market as well, but I couldn't because I was already committed. So I wish I had 10 of me to go to each city when someone called. but it's whatever the smallest area, you know, you can do, even if it's not the smallest thing you probably could do is knock on doors. But once you start getting a campaign going to where you get a group, okay, let's have a national knock on door day where each city, or at least in, you know, one city in each state will go out and knock on doors. You know, small things matter. So knocking on doors, TV ads, radio ads, going into the hospitals. I went to chemo treatment sites, just handing out sandwiches and, you know, telling them, well, do you know about marginalization? It tells you this, that, and the other. We have a support group. So, you know, just going into the areas where people need, and it's not an easy answer. There's no one size fit all. You just have to be creative and think outside the box.
You know,
I think what we've,
sorry.
no, go ahead.
The other thing that you need is really people need to know about clinical trials way ahead of when they actually need it. It's that surround sound that's needed by the patients from many different sources. So collectively, the message seeps in to their, cognition, right? And that's hard to do because we all have to align on how to help patients, no matter what disease they have, find the right source for themselves. In our system, not very easy, but I think collectively we could make it happen.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful.
I'm going to add one more to that. I'm sorry. For the clinical trials, my mom and I were looking for clinical trials when there was no other treatments for her. The one that we read, when we read it, and this is after I got educated, so to speak, I interpreted it totally different than what it actually was. So when I went back to the scientist that gave it to me and said, well, I don't think my mom wanted to do this because it looks like she needed a surgery. She said, oh, I didn't see that in there. So when she read it, she said, no, it was just you have to go to DC and they give you injections and then you come back. But the way it was written, even me with being educated on a graduate level, I didn't understand it because of all the medical jargon that was in it. So I think a lot of people, if you're trying to get minorities and on all education levels, it needs to be clear what the clinical trial is about, where you have to go, and what they're going to cover. Because going to DC twice a week from Suffolk, Virginia, that's like a 3.5, 4-hour drive there. And, you know, so we're talking about 8 hours on the road. She would not have done that. So just to make the language a little bit more clear and have what's expected, like on the first page and bullet points, you know, easy to read so that someone who don't finish high school can understand what's in that clinical trial and what's expected.
You know, Christy, you also mentioned that it was a last resort for your mom, right? But clinical trials are at many levels. She could actually get involved in clinical trials much earlier because we're looking at it at different phases. So that's also important to communicate because there's a lot of myths associated with clinical trials that don't need to be there. A lot of people tell me, you know, it's sugar pills, they won't give me the medicine, but it's really against standard of care. So you get better care in a clinical trial than you would going to a regular doctor. So that's something that we collectively as Pharma need to communicate better to people who may not understand it, right? So, and put it out clearly so they understand that standard of care is the best medicine that's available out there as of that time against the one that you're studying.
I think that awareness piece about that is kind of what we've been talking about and is crucial. And from what I'm hearing from all of you, it's like we said at the top, too big of a challenge for just one person, one entity. It really is going to be needs to be a collective decision to do these things and start moving forward in order to move the needle. So I think that some of the topics that you guys have brought up are some of the ideas are really good. I think key for me is hearing that communicating with the community is so crucial and important, and how we communicate and connect and in what language we use, because, you know, coming from the industry, we're used to speaking scientist to scientist, doctor to doctor. We need to realize that the audiences are coming from a different place, and making sure that our messages are aligning with that, and so that there's more understanding, building that trust through that education. So thank you all for that. That segment. I think now let's segue over into building relationship. I've got the next topic here. So Christy, in terms of building the relationship between at-risk patients and pharmaceutical companies, do you feel that representation on the corporate level is important?
Absolutely. I know earlier I said, you do not have to look like me in order for me to listen, and that is true. However, if the first time I was diagnosed, had I saw or been able to communicate with someone on a corporate level, once I couldn't, you know, get diagnosed, if I was able to speak with someone who actually looked like me and understood me, I think I would have been a better patient in the beginning, I think. From what I've seen, from what I've seen in some of my clients, they have refused medicine because they felt like the person they were talking to was just talking at them. They didn't really listen. I know in my mom's case, she was also misdiagnosed several times before she actually went to the right doctor who listened. This doctor actually looked like her, and she was the one that properly diagnosed my mom and told her, you know, there's no telling how long you're going to be here because it's pretty advanced. But because of their communication and because of my mom advocating for herself, she lived 12 years with a 1.5-year life expectancy in the beginning. So it makes, it's pretty much life or death to see someone, to have more diversity on the corporate level.
And I'd like to open that question up to our pharma partners. Are your companies making any efforts to, you know, diversify their executives and at different levels and within the company? Is this something that's kind of on the forefront?
We are a Japanese company, large pharmaceutical company in Japan. We have a very diverse workforce. And among our research and development folks, we have people from all creed, all shapes and sizes. And it's a wonderful thing to see. I have worked in other organizations where you don't see that diversity, and it affects the work at the end of the day. You know, people they come with different input into the process, and coming from a different background really forms that input. So I'm happy to report that we have a very diverse group of scientists, as well as others within the organization that actually don't realize what they're doing for the patients, but they really, even someone in finance is helping get the drug out into the communities that need it. So part of what I do is to make the entire organization realize that every role within that organization touches a patient. And it's really important to do whatever we do a little bit faster, so those drugs can get to those patients as fast as possible, because there's patients waiting.
I'll probably just add, the world that I'm living right now in precision medicine, that is so critical, right? Every patient matters, right? And the work, I think, to Lisa's perspective, is the importance internally to achieve that from a company level. It's like we are really hungry to make sure that people know about precision medicine, the value, what it means, how it can change your journey in managing cancer, right? And giving them hope, giving them options, which sometimes based on lack of education, communication, so on, that they know that they can have something else. I think it's super valuable. So I couldn't agree more. I think that, being in a small biotech, this is what we breathe every day, right? And it feels really good. At least that's something that I really, it just goes into what I believe in. And I think there's a lot of work to do, ultimately. Because yeah, precision medicine is all about every patient, I would say, and looking in every corner to find those patients that can benefit.
Yeah, and I think, I would echo both from JJ and Gisu. I come from a very large pharma into a very small biotech. And one of the things that attracted me to this biotech, well, I'm a nerd, so it was the science, but beyond the science, it was the fact that this was a really patient-centric organization and they were interested, excuse me, they were interested in my incoming desire to reach a more diverse patient audience and really committed to patient-focused medicines. And that just got me excited about the philosophy behind the organization. But then on top of it, the leadership of the organization that I'm at now was 80% and is 80% women. And so just that idea of being able to enter a room where there was, the leaders sitting around the table were diverse and committed to understanding that it's the ability to bring together diverse panels that allow you to have more avenues for raising new ideas, new thoughts, and allow it to be a trusting environment. So just that alone intrigued me about the company I moved to. But there has to be an intentionality about it. And Gisu, that's what strikes me about what you said, making sure that everyone in the organization remembers why we're here, whether you're in finance or whether you're in clinical operations or whether you're in manufacturing. At the end of the day, we're here because we believe that we're meeting an unmet need for patients. On the other side of that equation, making sure we're always talking to patients and listening to them about what their unmet need truly is, because it's easy to eventually just get into a process and to read guidelines and to think, okay, this is how care really happens. But Christy, as you shared with us, that's not how care happens. You have to fight for the right care. You had to fight for yourself. You had to fight for your mother. So, today the conversation is all about what can we be doing as industry partners to make that fight easier, to hear where the barriers are so that we know how to address them. And we're not going to be able to tackle every single barrier, but let's pick the ones that we can. Let's figure out who we need to partner with to tackle all of those barriers. And then let's learn. I think that's a hard thing to do as scientists. We like our data clean and we like to move forward based on it. But we have to be willing to learn. And as new data comes in, we have to be willing to change our approach. So it's going to be a journey, but I'm really glad to have people like you guys on that journey with us.
There's one more thing I could add is, our clinical trials always start with an idea. And one of the things that we've committed to do was to have a patient sit before, when the design of that idea comes through. Because the lived experience of the patients is really important to include early, before the protocol is developed, than afterwards, because there's not many changes you can make after, the recipe's been written. You really need to do that beforehand. So one of the things that we do is we get input from patients at every step of the way, from various patients, not just one type, and see if they match, and how do we change our processes internally to help look more like the patients that we serve. We walk in their shoes, as my template here says.
Love that. That's great. And I do fully believe that until we do bring in patients at that level of protocol development, design, and things like that, we're still missing a key voice in the equation, right? So it's great to hear that that's being done. And I'm hoping that more companies will follow that lead and do that.
It's not easy though, because there's a gap of knowledge for patients to understand where their voice will be important in the process. So there is some education that happens beforehand for the patients who sit on those protocol reviews to better understand why are we doing what we're doing, and then connecting the dots on what is important to those patients.
And something, Gisa, that occurs to me and I think it's fantastic how embedded the patient voice is throughout your drug development process. I think one of the things that I'm always having to remind myself is, we tend to use shorthand in the industry like the patient journey, and always reminding myself that it's not the journey, it's a patient's journey. And there are common themes, but really understanding that there are a number of communities, there are a number of individuals out there that don't get to take the patient journey because of the endemic barriers within our system, because of the our healthcare system. We know that based on who you are, where you live, your ZNA, which is a term to refer to, just the zip code that you're in, is going to affect the care that you get. And so making sure that we're not only listening to a patient, but we're intentionally seeking out different voices of different patients, hearing them and understanding where the differences are, and then figuring out what do we need to know about that? What can we do now? But also, what can we do later? And how can we continue to iterate to address those barriers? So it's not a one-stop, challenge, but I think what you're already doing is a fantastic step forward. And again, it comes back to partnership with groups like yours, Christy, with other patients, and going where patients are to hear from them.
So how can we leverage technology? JJ brought this up earlier. How do you in the industry see leveraging technology in order to reach patients at a more broad level?
Yeah, I'll probably take this one. I'll begin. There's many different ways, I would say, right? I think if we're in the clinical trial side, I think you have to have a patient-first approach, right? You got to think about it. It has to be part of your strategic imperatives internally, right? To start driving. That's the first stance, right? But then it's looking at options, right? I think Chrissy was saying, look, I had to drive 3 hours going one side and not 3 hours back. I mean, that is not patient-centric, guys, right? So what technology can do now is a lot of support in steps around the journey to get and manage your clinical trial. So the decentralization of clinical trials in a way that it is patient-focused, right, is a start. Now, I'm not saying that all my pharma folks are going to be able to do this right off the bat. No, but you have to start somewhere. You have to start thinking about, what can I do to help my patient, right, have a better experience? Now, having said that, technology plays a critical role, because now you're seeing well-coordinated operating systems, technology that can take some of that burden for the patient to get into that large academic center, where you can do things a little bit more locally, right? If you need to do a blood withdrawal, or if you need to do maybe a radiographic evaluation, all those things can now start being done in a very well regulated environment, so patients can actually stay or have a little bit more of patient centricity around not going and driving 3 hours, right? So those are small things, and there are companies out there that are supporting this, that are helping pharmaceuticals think about this and enabling this. So that's one start. Now, there's another area too around the communication, right? And I think that's where, from a pharma and coming from big pharma too, people get really nervous about this. But I think we need to start thinking about, what is the communication plan out there in social media that can help drive the communication and education to the audiences. Now, again, we're not trying to boil the water. You can start small. How do you help communities out, right? How do you engage with content that is relevant, that is well referenced, that there's scientific proof in the right layman's terms, right? All that, there's so much you can do, right? And technology is just your vehicle to get there in a way that is just more efficient for us and for the user to digest, right? And then the question comes out, and maybe I'm getting way too technical here, but being innovative, think beyond, right? Can you start building specific customer relationship management with advocacy groups, where you really are engaging in a constant manner with them, right? Understanding their needs and then working behind that to help out, right? So I think there's so much, but we have to start somewhere. We cannot just stop and say, okay, well, I can't do it because they told me this is not the way to go. Well, you have to try harder. How can you actually become patient-centered, right? So that's the start, I think. And then there's companies as Trajectory, right, that help patients in their journey, right? Where it doesn't have to be pharma all the time, right? I think sometimes we get, it's pharma, they have to pay for it. No, there's companies that are out there from a technology standpoint that can help the patient get educated in a way that's different through online systems, through registries, through capabilities that, people like Trajectory are doing, right? Helping them funnel, distill, understand, and then if applicable, then giving them options. So those are just some examples that how technology can actually help you drive a better patient-centric approach in clinical trials.
Well, and I think, I keep thinking, Christy, back to your statement that you would see an advertisement on TV and that would, spark going to Google or Dr. Google and figuring out, what's the next step I can take. And I think to JJ's point about where companies like Trajectory come in, it's about making sure that when you Google what's the next step I can take, that really meaningful information comes up, right? That connects you to the possibilities, to accurate information, but also to the possibilities of what do I do with this accurate information? How do I find that trial site that's not 3.5 hours away? But how does one come up, in my searches that tells me, look, this is where you live, or this is specific to your needs, or this is a trial that has such a large remote component that even though it's 3 hours away, you only have to go twice. And for the rest of the time, it'll get shipped to you or be local to you or, through home visits. I think that's where the technology that we're starting to see gets really, really exciting, is that at your fingertips are real answers, not just reams and reams and pages of information that really you can't take advantage of if you're a patient. So that's really exciting right now.
Yeah, I'll give you again an example where I live in the precision medicine side, right? Getting patients with specific alterations is really hard. And the question is, can you get them with a diversity that you need, right? Because normally you're going to get almost the same type of, population when you're doing this. And technology is really helping us enable that, right? How to find them in spaces where they might not have been willing to go into a large academic center in a big city, right? How you can actually then think about putting those decentralization tools so they can be part of something, right? I think that's really critical, because then that brings that diversity that everybody's talking about, right? You don't
And
have
you're increasing access,
exactly,
right, JJ?
because
You're increasing access to those patients that otherwise wouldn't have that as an option.
agree. And in my prior life, we were pushing really a lot the conversation around, look, a lot of the additional, the ones that are willing to do this but don't have the means because financially they don't have, how do you simplify their roadmap, right? It's not that easy getting from one part to DC, right? They might not have the money or the income to do that in that day. So how do you support them to put the right enablement through technology, right? To make sure that they can have that space and say, hey, look, you're going to have a prepaid card that's going to take you to take an Uber to your clinic or to your location, right? Those are the things that you need to think way ahead of time, right? For your clinical trial to then bring that diversity that you really want to emphasize.
One thing I want to bring forward is that we are a regulated industry, so we cannot incentivize patients to be on our trials. But a technology portion that could actually be very beneficial is to really have historical arms of trials be done through real world evidence, where patients don't have to be on the control arms of trials and they can be on the active, right? You're saving a lot of patients for something that you already know. You use their information and you use them in the control arm. I think that is a really good use of technology that is also very patient-centric.
Thank you for that. All right, we're going to get things wrapped up here, but Christy, I want to give you the opportunity to have the last word based on the discussions that we've had today. Any takeaways from you as far as what you've heard from our colleagues in the industry, anything that excites you, anything that you're looking forward to from a patient advocacy and a patient yourself standpoint?
Well, I'm actually excited that the real conversation has been started, and that all you guys have acknowledged that there is an issue, and you all have a great resource as far as how to take care of the issue, while being realistic about it, saying, okay, we can't do this overnight, but we're willing to listen and try and start putting things into motion to include minorities. So I'm very excited about that. I'm also excited to be a part of this panel, to hear the real voice of the patient, being a patient myself as well as a caregiver. It's just so much we have to learn. And I was kind of pushed into the master's program by my mom to learn more about it and to educate others. So this opportunity today have given me another resource. Well, actually 4 more resources to be able to email and call to get information when more people come to me and ask questions that I don't know. It just gives me more resources to get the correct answers.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say on behalf of Trajectory, we're so grateful for each of you being part of this panel today. I think this was a really important discussion. I think this is just the beginning, like we've said, but at least we're having this discussion. We're getting these ideas out there, hopefully inspiring others to do the same. So I want to just say, like, again, from us from Trajectory, thank you very much for your time. And for those watching and listening to this, thank you for your time as well. I hope that this gave you some good ideas. And stay tuned, because we will continue this series. Our next webinar that's coming up is going to focus on the barriers from the recruitment from the pharmaceutical company point of view. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be coming up next. It's going to be bridging the gap between patients and pharma, the road to inclusion. So from all of us here, I thank you very much for your time today and wish you the best for the rest of your day. Thank you.